So let's just jump into it. So welcome back to Veterinary Recruiting Insights, the podcast where we go through a variety of lab animal veterinarians' backgrounds and see how they got here, lessons that they learned. And today I have here joining me Dr. Lok Desi. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we had gotten connected actually on a reference call for Leah, and just listening to your background and the conversation we had, I thought it would be great to share with the audience, share with current and potential veterinarians.
I guess I would say it was pretty serendipitous in that sense. I think getting into this industry is very unique. And certainly there's, of course, many routes that one can take to get into this industry. I think for me, I had a bit of a non-traditional route, but typically, a veterinarian goes through undergrad, goes through veterinary school, pursues a residency in lab animal medicine, and networking. And of course, being in a residency program, becoming boarded allows you to network with a number of institutions, whether it's academic or the industry or somewhere in the government. And so through that route, they are well aware of the research world. So that's the more traditional route. For me, I went through vet school. I did post-vet school training with internships, and I came to know of the medical device industry, which is what I'm in now, via a recruiter. And at the time, I was not aware of such a large industry that requires veterinarians at the helm. And that was one way that I got into the industry, and I haven't looked back.
Fantastic. So can you help me understand the difference between a general lab animal vet or generally boarded and kind of those duties, and the difference between your duties in medical device, especially as it relates to client interaction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you're talking about a boarded lab animal veterinarian, of course, through their additional advanced training, they have experience in the regulatory arena. They, of course, depending on the program and the routes they take, they have varying degrees of specializations when it comes to the clinical management of certain species. For example, a non-human primate or rodent colonies, or your traditional swine, sheep. So that's typically my understanding of the lab animal boarded veterinarian versus a clinical veterinarian, which can be a boarded veterinarian or a veterinarian with a DVM or VMD, depending on your institution.
Can't forget the VMD.
Yeah, exactly. They can be involved in all of those things dependent upon their institution's needs. Certain clinical veterinarians may be in programs like the one that I'm a part of that is heavily clinical, which requires a lot of management, clinical management, post-procedural management, in-life management. Other non-boarded veterinarians may be in programs that are more regulatory or maybe more administrative. And so it really just depends on the type of program you're a part of and what kind of background and interest you really have.
Certainly. Did you find that you had an interest for surgery?
That's a great question. And I will say I have very little interest in the surgical side. I am more interested in the medical side, which is, in my case, a lot of perioperative consultations in terms of anesthesia, post-operative or post-procedural care, which can be intensive depending on the type of device or study that you're dealing with. And then, of course, the chronic management of various animal models during their in-life periods.
So I think this brings up an interesting point. So if you are the veterinarian and you are in med device, but you're not doing the surgery, who is conducting the surgery?
That's a fantastic question as well. So in laboratory animal research, and again, it depends on whether you're in an academic setting or you're in specifically a medical device setting versus a contract research organization. Typically, surgeries can be done by veterinarians, but there are surgical programs that are unique to the medical device industry and surgery specifically. Those are programs that are designed to train scientists to perform a certain level of surgical procedures. Of course, they are under the purview of veterinarians at the facility, and so they're not allowed to pursue any kind of surgical procedure on client-owned animals, so companion animals, for example, or at a human hospital or other institutions where they have not been approved. So even though facilities may not have veterinarians physically doing the surgeries, anyone that is approved to do surgeries in those institutions by the IACUC are under the authority of veterinarian oversight. Does that make sense?
No, it does. I just know from my experience with working with contract research organizations that sometimes there are the human surgeons that are coming in if they are testing a medical device and working on the animal models, and the veterinarian can be in the room there for care if something happens with the animals, to discuss comparative anatomy, things like that. Is that true at your facility?
You're absolutely correct. And yes, that does happen. And so, as I was alluding to a few moments ago, any individual who is doing a procedure in a research facility that is preclinical in nature or based off of animal models certainly can do those things, but there has to be a review of their credentials. In our case, it is done by our ICUC committee. In many institutions, it's very similar. They review that individual's ability to do that procedure in tandem with what the study protocol indicates. And as you mentioned, when those procedures are taking place, veterinarians are involved in collaborating with those human physicians or those surgical specialists who are not necessarily licensed or trained in the medical management of those animals under general anesthesia or surgical procedures. So your experience is absolutely in line with what happens in the facility that I'm a part of.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about what is a medical device to begin with. What is it? Why are they used? What is a medical device and what is not a medical device?
That is a good delineation because a lot of things when we think about medical device, oftentimes we think about cardiac pacemakers and we think about insulin pumps, or we think about some sort of an implantable or a device that you can carry that helps improve the lives of patients, both human and veterinary. But there are many other types of devices that don't necessarily or may not necessarily be known of or typically go under the radar of the general public simply because it's not something that's openly advertised, nor is it in the purview of everyday families. Things like a coronary arterial bypass graft or a left ventricular assist device. Certainly, human physicians and other researchers are well aware of these devices. So, those are some examples of your standard medical devices. Of course, that list is pretty exhaustive, but some examples of a non-medical device, maybe that's a great question actually, now that I think about it, but anything that could be not necessarily implantable or not something that is supporting a physiological function in a human patient or an animal patient. Oftentimes, an example of a medical device that may not be directly associated with a patient are anesthesia monitors or blood pressure monitors or those types of devices that don't directly treat a human condition, but they help assess that patient's stability overall. So something like a pulse oximeter or a temperature probe, something as simple as that can be a medical device. So the definition is pretty broad, but if you're thinking of it from a regulatory standpoint, there are definitely very strict classifications of those devices. Does that answer your question?
It does. And one thing that I found interesting that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of as I guess, a medical device would have been stents and meshes, things along those lines. So I guess something, but in a way it does because it is something that is implantable.
Not only implantable, but it also improves or supports the physiology or the dysfunction in a medical condition, for example. So you mentioned meshes. So if we think about a hernia mesh, for example, that's treating or oftentimes utilized for obviously hernias. Those can be obviously they're anatomically abnormal and need to be addressed, but they can also also be physiologically debilitating for patients. And so, yes, they're implantable, but there are also devices that can do the same thing without being implanted as well. And so, things like a dialysis machine, right? A dialysis machine physically isn't implanted into a human being or an animal, but a patient can be hooked up to a machine via an invasive catheter, such as a dialysis catheter. So
Right.
it is a really broad definition, but certainly when we think about medical devices, we think something that's implanted.
Right. So when it comes to testing on these medical devices, how is that going to be different than maybe a small molecule drug or a biologic?
Yeah, so medical devices have a pretty rigorous process to be tested for a variety of things before they even get to a state where they can be marketed for use or if they can be utilized safely in the clinical population versus other areas of medical research which have their own set of regulations that they have to follow to show that their product, whether it's a medication, whether it's some sort of a diagnostic test, is effective or not. So, with medical device, as I was alluding to earlier, there are three primary classes that we think about. Class 1, 2, and 3, pretty self-explanatory there. But class 1 medical devices are typically considered the least risky. Class 2 are about moderate. So an example of that could be blood transfusion kits. Then you have class 3, which is typically the devices that my institution deals with primarily, and those are medical devices that are of highest risk. So if you think about, again, cardiac pacemakers, implantable cardiac leads that may be helpful in regulating arrhythmias that are not responsive to medical therapy or are refractory to other types of treatments. And based on the classification of those medical devices is a path that a researcher or a sponsor or principal investigator will have to take in order to get that device approved or at least on market with a competitor, indicating equal efficacy. Does that make sense so far?
It does.
So once that classification is established, the testing, for lack of a better word, a testing phase begins. And so that can be either in vivo, it could be in vitro, it could be benchtop testing, depending on what potentially. Then you have class 3 medical devices, which can be cardiac devices or implantable pacemakers, for example. They could be coronary arterial bypass grafts, they could be implantable leads that treat arrhythmias that may be refractory to medical therapy or other types of therapy. Once a researcher or a sponsor has a idea of what class that their device is, and those standards, of course, I should have cited before, are established by the FDA. Once they've, of course, established that, then they have to ask the next question, which is, what is the indication of this device? Is this to replace a currently approved device because it's a more effective treatment, or it's an alternative treatment? Is this just to be a additional option for physicians and veterinarians to utilize as a therapeutic? Or is this something that is completely new and never before seen, or a novel type of treatment? So once that's determined, then a series of various testing begins, whether that is in vitro or in vivo, whether that's a benchtop testing. And a lot of those types of tests are done to reduce the use of animals, although preclinical testing or studies being performed on animals is a requirement for a device that is intended to eventually enter the human market in terms of medical therapies.
Right.
So, as you know, additional testings may include material characterization. So, for those who may not know what that is, that involves looking at how the device that is implanted will essentially, for lack of a better word, if whatever components of that device, how will they potentially react with the body, which can kind of overlap with biocompatibility a little bit. So, really understanding the make of that device down to the elements is what material characterization essentially is. Then, as I mentioned, biocompatibility is how will the body respond, how will the tissue, the blood, the other biologics respond to this device. As we know, anything foreign that our immune systems detect, our immune systems will attack. And so biocompatibility is primarily rooted in assessing how that device is going to react in an animal and a person.
So
And then, go
in
ahead.
effect, some of the material characterization and biocompatibility is a little bit like PKPD.
A little bit, one could say, assesses how something is going to potentially react in an in vivo state. And certainly, sometimes you may not have an equivalent model until you get to the preclinical testing or the animal model testing. So, yes, for similar purposes, that is a fairly reasonable comparison.
Okay. And then all of the fun regulatory trials and all of that.
And then, yes, then you go through the, non-GLP, GLP. For those who may not know what that is, that's good laboratory practice, which is directed, the standards for that are directed by the FDA through various federal regulations and laws, with essentially 21 CFR Part 58 being the primary guidance for that, but there are a series of other guidances for all of those testings. And a lot of the researchers work with the FDA in tandem or with the regulatory bodies, depending on where they are trying to get approval for those devices, whether it's in the EU or in the US. So, yeah, as you mentioned it in a very brief way, a lot of regulated studies then begin.
When we're looking at, let's just say, a small molecule drug, right? And we're bringing that through the regulatory pipeline. The documents that are being generated are used to support an IND, an investigative new drug, before it goes into clinical trials. What is the difference on the medical device side before it goes into clinical trials?
Yeah, so the primary step to that is a GLP study, and that study has to be performed on a preclinical model. And so, for example, you've invented or you want to get a new pacemaker out in the market that improves patient lives indefinitely, let's say. That's a really
Sure.
crazy example, but for the
Sure.
intents of understanding the concept here. And so you may work with the FDA to say, hey, I want to be able to show that this device, this pacemaker, is able to treat patients with these conditions for this long without requiring either a replacement, or it's safe such that it doesn't create any kind of lesions within the heart or doesn't create a state of infection, this, that, and the other, right? And the FDA will say, all right, well, in order to be able to do all of those things, you need to be able to do this, and show this in terms of the data. And so that researcher, in this case, you will go and work with a facility that tests or that supports the testing of these devices in specific animal models. You'll determine what is the most optimal model for that, which has a sense of translatability to human patients. You will set a study protocol. You will develop a study protocol, which will be reviewed by IACUC and a series of veterinarians, depending on the institution. The study will be conducted in a GLP fashion, which means that documentation practices have to be in a specific manner. There has to be a quality check, a quality review of that data to ensure that that data has appropriate validity and that the FDA can review without significant bias. And then if that FDA approves, gives you that 510 or pre-market approval, then you can get into human trials, clinical trials. And beyond that, if that stage then is successful and the FDA provides a review of that data, then it becomes a device that can be utilized for specific indications, as noted in that GLP study.
Okay. Just out of curiosity on the clinical trials side. So in phase one, you're kind of looking at dosing, dose ranging studies. You wouldn't necessarily do that with a medical device. Is there an analog, or is that just a step that's skipped because dosing is irrespective of this?
So it depends on the device. Of course, clinical trials have their own set of federal regulations, and they have a robust and rigorous set of criteria that must be met. What those are just depends on the device. So in that instance, it may not be synonymous with a small molecule study, for example.
Gotcha. So you were telling me earlier about an MDR or a CE mark. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the FDA, for lack of a better way of explaining it, the FDA has kind of an equivalent counterpart in Europe. And so the FDA has their federal guidance, which I mentioned, 21 CFR 58, which is a federal law. On the European side, you have something called medical device regulations, and they similarly have their own classifications, which for the most part are similar to the FDA classifications for medical devices and a few subcategories that they have. But in the US or with the FDA, for example, you have a 510 approval, 510K approval, or a mark. Equivalent to that is a CE mark in the EU. And what those are indicators that you are showing that your device is potentially as effective or better than a current approved device.
Okay.
Once you get a pre-market approval, then you're essentially in the clinical trial phase of that device.
Okay. Okay, great. So, in short, there's a lot of regulations that need to be followed by a multidisciplinary team.
Absolutely. There's of course, like I mentioned, and as we've been talking, there are federal regulations that are more geared towards uh, establishing what that device is, how does it function, whether it's safe or not, whether it's effective or not. And then there are other regulations that I, as a veterinarian, have to help uphold. And some of those maybe, again, the FDA, but primarily USDA, ALAC, the Animal Welfare Act, to be more specific. And then, of course, upholding GLP and non-GLP regulations.
Fantastic. So, yeah, I mean, this work is definitely important to human medicine. Is there any crossover, or are these where some of the developments for animal medicine comes in?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question, and it's certainly a growing area of interest when it comes to medical devices. Again, I go back to the cardiac pacemaker. That is primarily one of the more known devices that are implanted in canine and feline patients for various heart conditions. Oftentimes, those devices are initially obviously marketed for human use, but there have been veterinary pacemakers developed. There are many programs and universities that work with hospitals or other institutions where they can get pacemakers donated to them. So there is a growing industry there. Of course, there are other devices. For example, if we're talking about diabetes, you may be familiar if you've had a diabetic animal or a family member. There's something called a Freestyle Libre sensor, which is a continuous glucose monitor. That is something that allows a human patient to more closely monitor their blood glucose levels throughout the day. And it provides a more prompt indication when their blood glucoses are fluctuating. But on the veterinary side, that has been utilized quite frequently in diabetic canine and feline patients. So not a true inside the body device, but still a medical device that is utilizable in veterinary medicine to better manage a diabetic state in a feline or canine patient.
That's fantastic. I've seen some other devices that are created as well. We had another guest on the podcast that was another device on the market that was that they're bringing to market right now, and that was for infusion of drugs. So longer target tissue infusion that was specifically meant for the pets, which was pretty cool. So why would somebody want to take the path into medical device versus general lab animal medicine?
Yeah, I will use my own experience anecdotally here. And of course, that by no means is the only reason why a veterinarian may pursue medical device versus general laboratory animal medicine. For me, my interests stem from physiology. I like to know how things work, why things work the way they do, when they don't work, what are the different things you can do to compensate for that dysregulation. And so, although my introduction into the medical device world or in general preclinical testing was with a contract research organization, what I found in my time there was I was essentially kind of gravitating towards studies that involved a lot of physiologic management and understanding understanding how those devices help those patients or those studies compensate a diseased state.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And so you just wanted to be able to dive a little deeper, and it sounds like med device allows you to do that differently or to dive in a little deeper.
Yeah, it definitely allows me to dive in a little bit deeper. Of course, similar to a CRO, the regulatory standards that a veterinarian will uphold are relatively the same. But what medical device allows a little bit further is for veterinarians to be more involved in specific model developments for different disease states. It allows me to be more actively involved real time in device testing, in modifications of models to ensure that study objectives or study goals for that device are met. So it allows me to be a little bit more engaged beyond just the clinical management of those patients.
Okay. So for those individuals that have not been in med device before, can you walk me through a typical day or week in the life?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And here, I guess the answer to this question is also going to provide a little bit more towards your previous question. So typically my day revolves around what's on the schedule. So as anybody would do, as any professional, they're kind of looking ahead at what's coming up in the week, what types of procedures, what kind of care those procedures are going to require, and what does that long-term management look like. So on an ordinary day, I will come in, I will assess my patients, I will ensure that they are stable, comfortable, the usual things that any physician or doctor would do for their patients. In between that, I may round through the operating rooms and cath labs to ensure that those procedures are going well. If there are any needs, that those are addressed. If that may be an anesthesia question, that may be a surgical question, that may be a question about the study group wants to do something different, but that wasn't necessarily approved in the study protocol. What can we do? So, you talk about protocol revisions, things like that. Then, of course, there's the administrative side. So that may be something as simple as reviewing upcoming studies and their protocols. It may be attending various programmatic meetings that improve or that are essentially geared towards improving not only the research program but maybe specifically the veterinary care program. So every day is a little mixture of a number of things. At any given point, there are opportunities to collaborate with folks from all aspects of science. For example, you have engineers, you have scientists with specialties and PhDs, you have human physicians, you have other veterinarians. So intermingled in all of that is a significant amount of collaboration.
Sure. That's great that you get to work together with that team, be part of that team, and just produce something more than you could on your own.
Absolutely. I think the beauty of research, whether it's medical device, or it is pharmaceutics, whether it's academia, rests on the ability to bring folks from all aspects of specialties together to reach a common goal, which is improving the well-being of human and veterinary patients via devices, medications.
Okay. So I want to. I'm curious and going a little off script. I am curious about your thoughts on the Veterinary Practice Act of bringing in that mid-level veterinary professional into primarily in the companion animal space, but how you see that working or not working.
That's a really good question, Brad. And I think that the answer to that question is multifold. And the reason why I say that is the primary part of your question was, the impact that it would make or lack thereof, right? My personal experience was in private practice and then into this industry. So I see pure benefits for veterinarians, prospective or currently, in practice and are looking to enter an industry that they may not know of, but that truly impacts both veterinary and human medicine. The challenges of being in this industry, if you don't go through, a traditional route of a lab animal medicine residency, is of course understanding all the regulations, understanding the nuances and knowing why things are done the way they are. Because in this industry, in my experience, things are always done for a particular reason. And how that's implemented could, of course, vary from one institution to another. So that can potentially be a challenge that I see for folks or for veterinarians who are trying to enter this industry at a later stage in their professional career. But with the way the device and the medical device specifically community is growing, and the way medicine is progressing, I only see benefits for veterinarians to be at the helm. It really enhances the outcomes of studies. And I think in institutions like mine, having a clinical background in veterinary medicine, regardless of species, is truly beneficial in the enhancements of those programs, but also ensuring that safe, effective devices are available for therapy.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, what would you say? Kind of going back to the to the day in the life. How are you able to find that work-life balance? I know we discussed that earlier, but curious on your thoughts.
Yeah. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of how I go about that is kind of what we talked about in the past, which is balancing priorities. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, which is looking ahead in the schedule, understanding what is kind of coming down the pipeline per se for that week or the subsequent weeks, understanding my life outside of work and understanding what I can prioritize that week. So for example, if it's a week that is really intense with studies and post-op management of those cases, for example, if we're doing something truly invasive, it's a cardiac procedure, it's an implantable device, and that's going to require extensive post-operative care, and it's going to be an entire week full of those types of procedures, then, I will ensure that I have offset my other responsibilities with my colleagues, or I have rescheduled those or found protected time for those things so that I am not spending additional time where I cannot prioritize other aspects of my life, but also ensuring that those animals are taken care of. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I think what's important on that work-life balance is the ability to shift.
Mm-hmm.
Where you don't have a good work-life balance is where it's work all the time, or where you don't have a good work-life balance is where it's outside of work all the time. So
You're absolutely right.
the ability for those to go up and down, sometimes equally, creates that opportunity for balance, and trying to find an organization that can allow you to do that, and establishing and supportive of structures that would help you do that.
Absolutely. And with that comes the more you're able to prioritize, the more you're able to shift gears depending on your responsibilities. I think comes with a little bit of time and efficiency. But as you do it more and more, you become more effective at it. And I think you truly, at least I do, I feel that I've established a little bit more understanding of how to prioritize and how to achieve that level of work-life balance as you're sharing right now. It's not always necessarily about working less hours, as you've said. It's about how can you work efficiently in the hours that you do while also maintaining your life outside of those responsibilities.
Yeah. What else did we not cover?
I think that I feel like I threw a kitchen sink of information at you and to the listeners today. But really, when I was going through vet school, we knew that there is laboratory animal medicine. And my experience before vet school was in an academic institution from a research perspective. And so in my time since vet school, we have a number of veterinary students, veterinary prospective students, residents come through, and it's good to see that more and more people and veterinary students and residents are becoming aware of research in medical device or research with contract research organizations. And there is truly a huge opportunity there for veterinarians. And every opportunity that I get, I try to kind of share this industry and share what I've learned and some of the opportunities that veterinarians have here, because it's not an unknown fact, but in general, there's a shortage of veterinary professionals, whether it be veterinarians or technicians. The medical device, or in general, the laboratory animal community, is not immune from that. So any opportunity I get, I kind of boast about this industry a little bit.
Yes, yes, I can see that. I try and do that as well. I was, on a recruiting and information mission earlier this week, trying to recruit middle schoolers to come into the field of lab animal medicine. So we went to my son's middle school and gave a couple of 25-minute talks, and the first group was okay with the questions. But when I said we're going to trade questions for candy, then the really good ones came out.
I can imagine. It's really amazing to see the number of schools and colleges that are invested in STEM and exposing those young minds to some of the work that's being done now, because you can only imagine what their generation will do once they get to these stages and have this early on exposure. If you ask me if I was in middle school and I was exposed to any of these things, I would probably laugh and say, what is a medical device? What is that? What do I do with this kind of thing? So
Yeah.
it's really promising to see those young minds getting exposed, and it'll be interesting to see what they do in this industry and for human and veterinary medicine alike.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me today. Appreciate the time, and I'm sure the listeners very much enjoyed the information.
Thank you so much, Brad. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.